we encounter the risen Jesus, we get to exchange our one-way ticket of hopelessness for a round-trip ticket for joy and hope and peace and eternal life. That's the message of Easter, that we get to cash in a one-way ticket and get a round-trip ticket. So as I bring this message to a close, I'd like to quickly answer this last question if you're still taking notes. What can we learn from this 14-mile walk? And I want to point out two things. What can we learn from this 14 miles that changed the world? Number one is this: the circumstances we face aren't as important as the conclusions we draw. The circumstances that we all have to face, they're not as important as the conclusions you draw. All too often, we tend to lose hope when we get focused on our circumstances and we begin to draw wrong conclusions based on what we're going through. And the difference between the first 7 miles and the second 7 miles was not the circumstances. It was the conclusions that they had drawn. Nothing had actually changed about the circumstances. Jesus was just as alive during the first 7 miles as he was in the last 7 miles. Everything that had happened from Friday to Sunday was the same. Everything that was going on was the same. There were no different circumstances. It was only the conclusions that they were drawing. Here's what I mean. Remember when Jesus came up and joined the conversation during the first 7 miles of the walk? What did he say to them? What did they say to him? Jesus was a man from Nazareth. He was a prophet that did miracles. He was a mighty teacher, and we had hoped that he was the Messiah. Notice everything they said was in the past tense. Everything had to do with the conclusions that they had drawn. Their conclusion was that Jesus was dead. He was awesome. He was an awesome guy. He was a prophet. He was a mighty teacher. Nobody taught like him. It was amazing, but he's dead. It was past tense. And we had hoped that he was the Messiah, but not anymore. We had hoped, but it was past tense. And Jesus began to challenge those assumptions by calling them foolish and saying, didn't all of the prophets actually say that this would happen? In other words, the circumstances, guys, don't matter. It's the conclusions that you're drawing right now is why you're having the problem. And once they realized that Jesus was alive, the conclusions were different. It moved from past tense to present tense. Jesus is the God-man from Nazareth. Jesus is the prophet, and he's still doing miracles. Jesus is the mighty teacher, and Jesus is the Messiah we are still trusting in today, 2,000 years later. The circumstances were still the same. Jesus had died, he was buried, and he was resurrected. But the conclusions were very different once they encountered the presence of the risen Christ. So I want you to think about how that truth could affect you this Easter season, right? Maybe you're looking at your circumstances and you're drawing conclusions based on the Jesus that's hanging on the cross instead of the Jesus that's risen and defeated sin and death. And I want to challenge you that if you're in the first 7 miles of your situation, that it's time for an encounter with the risen Jesus. It's time for you to turn around and make your way back towards all the plans that God had for you from the very beginning. See, these guys were walking 7 miles away from Jerusalem, from the center of everything that God was doing. They were leaving town. And I want you to know that if you're in that 7-mile stretch and you're walking away and you're making all these wrong conclusions based on circumstances, you need to sit with Jesus and be in his presence and turn around and start to walk back towards the place you belong. Here's the second thing I believe we can learn from this 14-mile walk.